Okay, Paul. So this is Paul O'Brien talking about Michael Collins and 1916.
Over the years, much has been written about Michael Collins, his life, his participation in Ireland's struggle for independence, the treaty negotiations and his death have all received attention from historians. Michael Collins' first military engagement was that of the 1916 Easter Rising. He entered the General Post Office on O'Connell Street, Dublin, as the aide-de-camp to Joseph Plunkett, an officer and signatory of the proclamation, who along with James Connolly masterminded the strategies and tactics of the 1916 Easter Rising. Michael Collins would find himself fighting alongside Central Command during the insurrection. In recent years, historians and well-known media personalities have called into question not only the reason for staging an insurrection, but also the way it was carried out. Very few, if any, of these people have served in the armed forces, taken part in an uprising, or have studied military tactics. It is a well-known military axiom that no plan survives contact with the enemy, and in the case of the 1916 Easter Rising, this truism is substantiated. What plan did Collins find himself involved in? The military plan, devised by Joseph Plunkett and James Connolly, called for the occupation of a number of positions within the city with an area of operations of 11 kilometres. While the General Post Office on Sackville Street was both the military and civil headquarters of the insurgents, it was not a fortress. This powerfully constructed stone building, commanding the main street of the city, was the communications centre for Ireland. By occupying this building, the insurgents were the precursors of the modern coup, as throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, the occupation of television and radio stations were the main targets of revolutionary organisations. Though the General Post Office lacked adequate fields of fire, its location made it difficult for British artillery spotters to direct gunfire onto the position. The countermanding order that led to the postponing of the rising and the interception of the Odd, a ship laden with arms and ammunition, greatly reduced the operational capabilities of Republican forces. The Dublin Brigade consisted of an estimated 3,000 volunteers, and the citizen army had a strength of approximately 400. On Easter Monday, only 1,000 mustered, with a further 800 reporting for duty later that week. By the end of the Easter week, the headquarters battalion at the General Post Office had 350 to 450 personnel fighting in the area. The insurgents showed remarkable military competence during a week of severe fighting. Michael Collins showed great leadership abilities during this period, organising work details, the construction of defences, being described by volunteer Desmond Fitzgerald as the most active and efficient officer of the place. Though lacking in suitable weapons, years of training in urban combat, the familiarity of the area of operations, the high standard of the junior officers, such as Michael Collins at that time, all contributed to an Irish force that managed to withstand a week-long attack by one of the most powerful empires in the world. Republican headquarters staff were directing operations in a city that comprised 2 positions north and 4 positions south of the River Liffey. The headquarters battalion established a perimeter defence which provided protection for the provisional government at the General Post Office. However, the failure to occupy Trinity College left a gap between insurgent posts that the British exploited. Using Downing Street as a highway into the centre of the city and the college as a forward operating base, the British were able to deploy troops into the centre of the city. Republican forces had a split command, with Pearse, the idealist, wholly committed to the cause of Irish independence, and Connolly, the realist, who also believed in the cause of liberty, but knew that his forces were outnumbered 20-1. Connolly realised by Tuesday morning that reinforcements were not coming to the city from the country, and that his command stood alone. He remodelled his strategy to take this into account, redeploying his forces and strengthening his defences around the general headquarters. His Marxist theory that the British government would not permit the use of artillery to subdue an urban insurrection has often been criticised. Connolly believed that the British capitalist class would never permit the deployment of artillery into a city in order to quell a rebellion. The devastation of property caused by such an act would amount to millions of pounds. However, the British government did approve of the action taken by the military, and the centre of Dublin city was levelled, bringing the rising to its conclusion. Thousands upon thousands of pounds worth of damage was done to the centre of Dublin city. All around the General Post Office was devastated by artillery fire, which burned for many, many weeks. If Connolly had miscalculated the British Army, so too did many others. Since 1914, Europe had witnessed a new type of warfare, one that encompassed mass shellings of cities with little or no regard for civilians or property. This new type of warfare was to develop as the century progressed. Connolly's exit strategy was flawed, as the initial plan was to fall back to the Four Courts area and then to withdraw north into County Dublin. The failure to secure these egress routes resulted in both garrisons, that of the General Post Office and the Four Courts, being surrounded and isolated. A secure fallback position would have given the volunteers just enough time to consolidate and defend themselves while they came up with an alternative solution to extricate the battalions from encirclement. 20,000 British troops arrived in Dublin within 3 days, seriously outnumbering the Irish volunteers. General Lowe, the British commander's deployment of machine guns at high vantage points throughout the city exploited the high ground, giving clear fields of fire. With the artillery, he used the weapon's capacity for indirect fire to devastating effect. Similarly, his men using the trench mortars also fired upon volunteer positions. Improvised armoured personnel carriers were used to great effect in order to gain a foothold in areas where the volunteers were well entrenched. British troops were able to move fast and under their cover to secure areas. Many of the British troops in the Sackville Street area of operations had been fighting since Monday, and the severe urban combat was unprecedented in the history of the British Army. Never before had troops been engaged in such combat conditions, and the race through buildings, the sudden firefights, the constant incoming bullets, and the smoke, mayhem and confusion of fighting in an urban battlefield took their toll on both sides. As the battle drew to an end, Collins realised that the Irish force would have to surrender or face annihilation. Desmond Fitzgerald wrote, "Michael Collins sat in the corner, a look of horror in his eyes, a pallor spreading over his face." Apart from the obvious reasons of defeat and surrender, Collins had lost many friends killed during the rising that week. The surrender, the executions and imprisonment that followed that surrender have all been well documented. Michael Collins learned from the insurrection that the British Empire could not be defeated in open warfare, and that a new type of war would have to be waged against the British Crown. A reorganisation was needed, and a plan was devised in the years that followed that would make Michael Collins be known internationally as the man they couldn't catch.